So I want to conclude with some notes on this year's Haskell Symposium and this year's Haskell Implementers Workshop, and then some notes about what's coming for next year. So we'll start out with this year. To Haskell24 this year, we had 20 submissions. That's 14 papers, 4 functional pearls, 1 tutorial, and don't read the rest because it spoils a joke 2 slides hence. We accepted 10 of these. For the Haskell Implementers Workshop, we had 6 proposals. They were all accepted. Unfortunately, one of the proposers was later not able to attend, so we were only able to have 5 presentations from the Haskell Implementers Workshop at HIW this year. And I want to take a moment to thank the program committees of both events for their work in preparing this year's program. Okay. There were a couple of changes to the way we ran these events this year. The first change is that the Haskell Symposium invited talk proposals. So the first 3 bullets of this were in the call for papers. We said that talk proposals should report work in progress, that they would be evaluated for novelty and relevance, but were not expected to include finished results. And sort of the difference between theory and practice, it worked out that the talk proposals could be included in the proceedings, although it was not required that they be included in the proceedings. And in case you're wondering sort of what's the advantage to submitting a talk proposal, well, of course, it means you get to give a talk at the Haskell Symposium. It means you get to get feedback from the community. It means you get to get feedback from the program committee, and that we had a 100% accept rate for talk proposals this year. So there's a very high return on investment. That's 1 out of 1 accepted. The other change this year is that we combined the Haskell Symposium and the Haskell Implementers Workshop. This was a change that was initiated by the chair of the Haskell Implementers Workshop. But we ended up concluding that we had about maybe a little over half a day's worth of content at HIW, maybe a little over a day and a half's worth of content prepared for Haskell. And so by combining them, we were able to put together what I think was a pretty compelling and pretty well-filled 2 days of content for the Haskell Symposium. We owe thanks to Marco and Naringa for sort of allowing us to do this after registration was already open. I know there are at least 6 people out there who had already registered for and paid for the Haskell Implementers Workshop, and Naringa worked with you to sort of accommodate that. On the other hand, I also know that people may already have made travel plans, so I do apologize for the disruption that this caused. And I think this is not the solution going forward. We need to have a better idea of how much Haskell we're going to have and when we're going to have it. The Haskell Symposium is sort of operating on the sort of 2 chairs at a time style that I think most SIGPlan events have adopted, where we have sort of 2 co-chairs rotating on a 2-year window. And so this is the final year that Nikki Vazou has been chairing the Haskell Symposium, so I think we owe her a round of applause for the last 2 years. All right, so let's talk about next year. And of course, the first announcement is the chair rotating in for next year is Ningning Shi. And we will now proceed to the requisite griping about the submission count. So the ongoing challenges for the Haskell Symposium, I think. The first of all thing, I think if you looked around the room at this event, the room's been full most of the past 2 days. I think there's been a lot of participation. So the community participation in this event is great. I think the talks have been good. I've enjoyed the talks that we've had. I think, those of you who submitted papers, hopefully you felt like the reviews were serious. So for the most part, all of these things seem like this is a thriving and, event. On the other hand, we have over time a significantly declining number of submissions, and that makes it harder and harder for the program committee and the program chairs to put together an event that sort of meets the enthusiasm that the community is bringing to the event itself. Now, I don't particularly like data, but I did make a graph. And this is comparing ICFP submissions in red to Haskell Symposium submissions in yellow, gold. And I guess the point that I want to make is that while it is true that there is a sort of an overall trend perhaps in a declining number of submissions to both events, the drop-off has been more severe for the Haskell Symposium. There are a number of possible explanations that we could have for this, and there are a number of possible remedies which perhaps vary with the explanation that you accept. And I don't know that there's a single consistent answer for sort of what's been causing this decline. So, one proposal is for the academics in the audience. This has to do with, the sort of increasing focus on bibliometrics, right? The Haskell Symposium is not counted in CS rankings. It's considered a tier C venue in the core rankings, and so if your promotion or your sort of school's rankings depend on participation in sort of highly ranked venues, that might disincentivize participation in the Haskell Symposium. An idea that I was very fond of until I was confronted with data was that the sort of perhaps the zeitgeist had moved on a little bit. That in 2015, which was the high point for Haskell Symposium submissions, if you were doing cool functional programming with types, you just naturally did it in Haskell, and so that brought people to the symposium. Now, if you're doing cool functional programming with types, maybe you do it in Agda, maybe you do it in Idris. The results from ICFP, like Brigida's slides made it seem like maybe I'm wrong about this. There's still a lot of ICFP work being done in Haskell, but perhaps that there's a bit of difference there. Simon yesterday was sort of using the term incumbency, right? Maybe it used to be that Haskell was sort of interesting and new, and people were talking about it for that reason, and now Haskell is sort of well established, and what was the phrase that he kept using? We're filling out the design space, but that sort of generates less excitement for talks at the symposium. I don't know what the right answer is here, but regardless of the right answer, it is continuing to make it challenging to put together a full program for both of these events. So some changes for next year. So the first is that the 2025 instance of the Haskell Implementers Workshop will move to ZuraHack. Okay, so if you're not familiar with ZuraHack, which I'm not, it's a 3-day Haskell event in Switzerland. It takes place every year. It has 400 or so attendees. That's about ICFP sized. And the last 2 years, there's been a co-located event operated by the Haskell Foundation, which tries to disseminate knowledge about the core tools and the ecosystem of Haskell. Starting from next year, we'll try locating HIW there as one day of that Haskell Foundation event. So unlike in previous years where that was entirely programmed by the organizers of ZuraHack and the Haskell Foundation, this will still have an open call. There'll still be a chair of the Haskell Implementers Workshop. That'll be announced real soon now. There'll be a program committee. So it's still an open event. People are welcome to submit talks, but we'll be hosting it in Switzerland instead. And if you have questions or comments about that, the organizer of ZuraHack is right here, and he'll be able to help discuss any more concrete details of that. Again, this is obviously a temporary, or this is a trial, right? So, if it's a terrible idea and everybody wants HIW to move back to ICFP, talk to the steering committee as time goes on. What that means is that the Haskell 2025 will be the only Haskell focused event at ICFP 2025. We'll continue to invite talk proposals, demos, and lightning talks as we did this, well, almost as we did this year. We're expecting to have 2 separate calls for participation in the Haskell Symposium next year, though. We'll have a call for papers at the usual time, sort of right after you've gotten your ICFP rejection. And then later in the, I'm sorry. I didn't think that was the best joke in this talk. Later in the summer, once people have perhaps decided whether or not they're going to Singapore, we'll have a call for talks and demos sort of closer to the time that the HIW call is now, perhaps right after you've gotten your rejection from the Haskell Symposium. We will still sort of solicit lightning talks and such during the event. And I want to sort of emphasize that part of the goal here is to invite the variety of content that would have been presented at the Haskell Implementers Workshop to be presented as part of the Haskell Symposium, right? So I think one thing that we learned this year from the relatively low number of talk proposals is that many people still perceive there to be some sort of difference between these events, that some work isn't suited for the Haskell Symposium, is more suited for the Haskell Implementers Workshop. And hopefully going forward, we can have a view that like this sort of work is all welcome at the Haskell Symposium, just perhaps in a different category. I think there's an open question which we need to answer before people make travel plans, though, which is to say, how many days do we think that this event will fill, right? The HIW chair makes a significant amount of effort to make sure that there are sort of participants at HIW. We need to decide, I think, hopefully get input from all of you as to whether you think that it makes sense to continue a 2-day Haskell event at ICFP. Of course, I think or sort of to conclude my part, I'd like to thank the sort of most important contributors to the Haskell Symposium, and that's all of you who attend Haskell every year. So thank you. These are big changes afoot, so I think the most important thing, though, at this point is I would like to hear, and I think the steering committee and next year's chair would like to hear what you all view as sort of the future of the Haskell Symposium, what's important, what we need to preserve, what we can change, how we can be better. So at this point, I'd sort of like to invite anyone who'd like to. I've got one of these mics over there. We've got one here. What do you think we should do?
If it is the case that the number of submissions are declining, then it makes sense to go from 2 days to one day.
So almost every time I talk to anybody who is chairing a workshop, they moan about submissions falling. So I think one thing we should be aware of is it's not just us. This is something that is happening to many, many workshops in a wide variety of different topics, at least in PL. I mean, maybe the problem is that young people today are doing machine learning. But
where's Andy?
If I would speculate, I would speculate that perhaps after the pandemic, people are simply less productive, and so more papers will, there'll be fewer papers overall, a higher proportion will be in ICFP, the workshops will struggle for a little while. I know that in our department, there's still a lot of remote working going on, and when I read articles again and again nowadays about how remote working is turning out not to be as productive as working in the office, maybe it's all going to pass. I wouldn't be too quick to make very big changes. Okay.
So
I was going to say, so John ended by saying I wouldn't be too quick to make very big changes. So now, to hear the other side of the coin.
Oh, yeah, Garrett knows where I'm going here. So I mean, my first reaction actually after hearing this was that what you were proposing, I mean, you described sort of a lowering of sort of content amount, which then I expected to hear that we would be contracting. But instead what you're describing sounds like an expansion in that now HIW is sort of, the event is going to carry on but in a different venue, which I think is a fantastic idea. Those of you who haven't attended Zurahack is amazing, and I think putting HIW there makes good sense. But if with Haskell Symposium also accepting lightning talks now and talk proposals, it sounds like Haskell Symposium is sort of trying to carry on as a 2-day event while sort of HIW is moving out, which I think may be okay. That's sort of one comment and direct reaction to this. Another is when I saw a Future of Haskell Symposium discussion on the program, I primed myself. And I want to make a radical proposal that we take down that wall. So on the other side of that wall, at least yesterday, was the ML workshop. And I saw several talks at Haskell Symposium. I saw several talks at the ML workshop. And the content of the talks would make sense to both communities. So what I would love us to think about as a functional programming community, and yes, we are Haskellers, but we're also functional programmers, is should there be some kind of functional language symposium, and then separate from that, there might be a Haskell workshop, if I can say, sort of to take the sort of the peer-reviewed proceedings publications and funnel that toward some kind of combined workshop that's not quite ICFP, it's not quite as theoretical, but it encompasses both languages like Haskell and languages like the ML family and Idris and Agda and Kak or Rock as its changing name. You know, all of these languages can sort of find a home. And I've also heard from the more ICFP-focused community that some of these more implementation-focused papers and some of the, you know, oh, here's a really cool thing we can do with functional programming, some of those papers have been a little harder to get accepted at ICFP, or we've seen fewer of them, maybe by having this other venue that would still be co-located with ICFP. They may find a home. I don't know, I see this as a possible sort of reimagining of some of this, of this sort of extra space around ICFP that might reinvigorate some life into it, while still keeping a dedicated Haskell space, and I would say a dedicated OCaml space. So tear down yesterday's wall, not today's wall. Sometimes things are really specific to one implementation. Anyway, I'd just like to sort of throw that out. I'm not on the steering committee for any of these events at the moment, so I don't have direct say here, but I'd like to invite others to maybe think about this, and I'd be happy to sort of help think about it.
I don't see why those papers shouldn't be part of ICFP. And given what you just said, how would you know, what would the difference in brand be between ICFP and this symposium? I find it a little hard to see.
That's a great question, and one I don't have a good answer for, but I've been worried about in the back of my head. And I am currently actually on the ICFP steering committee, and I'm wondering what levers I can pull there to try to steer ICFP also in this direction. So I'm sort of trying to tackle this from multiple angles, maybe unhelpfully or sort of self-contradictorily or something, but trying what I can.
Yeah, just to kind of follow up on something you said, right? So, because, you know, you said, you know, once we get our ICFP rejections, you submit to the Haskell Symposium, right? And I feel like we shouldn't view ourselves as a lesser ICFP, right? So, you know, in the Haskell Symposium, we have space for, you know, less kind of type theory focused stuff that's more, you know, it's Haskell related, but it's not just the lesser ICFP, right? So, you know, and sometimes, you know, I had the experience of, you know, I submit something that's a bit more out there, and then you get reviewers that have, you know, somewhat familiarity, right? We don't have, you know, we should broaden the submission space because, like Simon said, we've, you know, kind of filled out the design space now. So maybe now we're moving into a more, you know, software engineering kind of work, and we would like to have more people that are familiar with that kind of work in the community. Yeah, so, you know, so just be careful of this, of viewing ourselves as some sort of, this is ICFP work that couldn't make it in with its Haskell work, right? So, yeah.
No, I want to say that's absolutely fair. I think you know, the first time I served on the Haskell PC, which was 2015, you know, the program chair sort of identified that as one of the points that the PC needed to be clear on, was that there was a unique identity to the Haskell Symposium that wasn't just, you know, ICFP Day 4. And I think hopefully we've all seen talks over the past couple of days that sort of celebrated the sort of uniquely Haskell flavor of this event. So, you know, I mean, the timing is what it is, but.
I think what I want to say ties what Matthias said back to Richard's proposal. So I was 100% with that idea until you started talking about Idris and Agda, because I feel like there needs to be some refuge of term-level functional programming. So I don't want to give that up and move everything into cuckoo land.
So what's your opinion on dependent Haskell?
Show me one, and then I will say what my opinion of it is.
So what's going to happen with the state of GHC talks? Are there going to now be two, or does HIW at Zurihack get it, and we no longer have that kind of state of Haskell at the symposium?
So I should start out by saying, you know, Simon offers to give that talk, and I don't know that the Haskell Steering Committee or anybody else can sort of demand it. I certainly imagine that Simon will continue to attend ICFP and continue to attend the Haskell Symposium, and I think hearing about the state of GHC will always be welcome at the Haskell Symposium. And so I hope we'll continue to hear about that at the Haskell Symposium. I imagine there would also be space for hearing about it at Zurich Hack, and perhaps with GHC on a sort of 2 releases a year cadence, it might make sense anyway to hear about the state of GHC twice a year.
Right. Yeah, so I was wondering, I'm a proud ICP rejected author and proudly accepted by Haskell Symposium. So I was wondering, I never think less about the Haskell Symposium, to be honest. So I was wondering if in the data, one way to answer the question, because you were saying like there are 2 possible answers here, right? One is the publish, because publish and perish, people stop, publish or perish, people stop sending work here, right? So if we can get the numbers, if we could get the numbers like how many rejection from ICFP went to Haskell Symposium, could be a way to clear up that. I don't know if we can get that data or not. But regardless, if that data shows like it's because of publish or perish, then we should think about, I will suggest a more informal Haskell Symposium, where that, like we are going in that direction with the talk proposals, industry relevant people being invited and so on, going more on that direction and not being that formal, because if people are not sending papers because of this, I don't see any other way around.
So I have to say, I was really hoping to sort of have confirmation of that this year when a load of talk proposals arrived, right, of all the sort of things that people wanted to talk about at the Haskell Symposium, but were later going to lead to ICFP or POPL submissions. Maybe things don't just change overnight. Give it time, yeah.
I didn't even know that they were there as an option. That's my lack of curiosity. But as an example.
Yeah, but that's fair. We need to do a better job of publicizing it, and hopefully having a distinct call for sort of talks and demos. The call for demos goes out every year too, right? And I think we get very few, but there are certainly things worth demonstrating, and worth sort of showing that kind of thing. We see them in lightning talks, so hopefully we can do a better job of publicizing that part of the symposium.
I would say one thing to be careful of is that for people who are submitting, there's in my mind, a very distinct cost-benefit analysis. So the benefit is, there's a social benefit of getting the ideas out there, but in terms of people who are early on in their academic careers, there are certain universities who, certain venues count, certain venues don't. If you tear down that wall, make sure you keep the title symposium, because if you go below that line, the cost-benefit's not worth it anymore. And I think you may also have a similar problem with the talk proposals, is those don't necessarily count when the universities come around to looking at those. So just be careful. Yes, do things to try to attract more, but realize that some of them, yes, you're making the job easier, but they also don't count as much, so people might not be as interested.
Yeah, so there was a point brought up, because there have been conversations about this for several years. That if you're, for example, asking your company to fund your travel here, and there's no sort of proceedings in which you can say like, well, I have to go because I'm presenting this thing, that may sort of diminish the value of that. So we are sort of aware that sort of having a distinct proceedings of the Haskell Symposium, that people can say like, look, there is my thing in the proceedings, has value, outside of just having a proceedings.
So that's definitely true what you just said, but ML Workshop doesn't have proceedings. It has a nice program. I think that there's evidence of a bunch of other co-located events with ICFP that don't have proceedings that still have full programs. So that's just some counter evidence. Well, so I think between OCaml and ML Workshop, we only had like 5 talks from Jane Street, so there's a lot of talks from other people too.
I want to say that the talks, we didn't put to plan them on the proceedings, but people asked us to put it on the proceedings. I don't know why, I don't see a reason either, but if somebody wants to put it on the proceedings, I think it's not a lot of work. We don't mind doing that. And so if you submit a talk and it does not go into the proceedings, you come here, you present it, you get feedback, and then you are free to submit it in a different place. So I think this is a very good thing to do.
So I want to think not about people in companies who are trying to get approval from their manager to attend, but about research students. And I'm imagining, the two situations. The research student goes to their supervisor and says, I've got a paper in the Haskell Symposium, will you pay for my travel? That's very different from going and saying, I've got a talk proposal accepted, because there's no paper at all. So quite apart from how funding agencies bean count conferences, simply the fact of having a paper in a proceedings being published is, in our department, that could make the difference between a student getting the money to travel and not getting the money to travel.
Would it make a difference if it was labeled as an extended abstract instead of a talk proposal? That's my question.
Is that a question for me?
Yes.
I think that perhaps the labeling is down in the noise. Probably have a policy of decommenting that with the paper.
But it can be, if you start to label things, for example, as posters, then that can have a different, drop people into well, it depends. So it can be negative because you don't have paper, then some institutions won't pay for travel. Correspondingly, some other institutions have special programs for student posters. So it can be positive and negative.
Could you, James, could you just say something about why we are removing the Haskell Implementers Workshop? Because as I think about it, I think that it's going to be a loss to the event.
So I think it was more a sort of move of opportunity that, that it was difficult to program a day of the Haskell Implementers Workshop. I think there was difficulty last year. There were sort of fewer talks proposed to HIW this year. And there was an opportunity to try doing HIW at Zurich Hack and to see if that makes a difference, right? So I think that the idea was if we were having difficulty programming the event as part of ICFP, we were going to be looking at 2 days regardless, and there was an opportunity to say well, here's HIW in sort of a different form, then we might as well see if that sort of led to, there still being 2 good days of Haskell content at ICFP and the sort of, opportunity to take advantage of what's going on at Zurich Hack and
maybe specifically to come back to that question about HIW, in the discussions in the program committee, we also talked about a change of demographics of GHC developers. So you see the majority of active GHC developers at Zurich Hack, and most of them work in industry, and you don't have that strong overlap between the core GHC contributors and academia that maybe you had 10 years ago.
So the property of talks, at least from what I see, is that talks are kind of like both and. So, papers on the other hand is like either or, because there's that plagiarism rule. So, you could still have HIW, right, at ICFP, and you could, throw a special invitation to some of the better talks at Zero Hack to come here.
I'm not completely sure whether that would work. I think so just to give a little bit of an example, I mean, lightning talks have always been a big part of HIW. For lightning talks in particular, nobody is just going to come to this event if they're not already attending. So they really benefit from people already being there. Good talks, yeah, they could be invited, but again, like, is somebody who's not already going to be here just going to come with an invitation if it's not a paid invitation, right? And academic conferences, unlike commercial or more like open source events, don't really have a tradition of paying speakers to get there. So I think, yeah, I mean, I think the idea of moving HIW preliminarily to Zurich at least is a good test. I don't think it's necessarily the final answer forever, but it's a good test to see how it will work. The problem I primarily see with that is that it's one location, right? So it's always going to be in Zurich, which disadvantages people who are far away from Zurich. And so that's my main worry about that. But otherwise, I think it's an interesting experiment I would like to see work out. Otherwise, I mean, I'm not in academia, but I like Richard's suggestion to potentially try changing the format of Haskell Symposium a little bit more rapidly, because, yeah, I agree. I think it's always been actually rather stressful as a participant on these days where tidy and ML workshop and Haskell Symposium happen all at the same time to make choices. And I do also think that there are lots of talks that are actually interesting to all of these communities. So like the branding problem I see as well. I don't have an answer to that. But I do think there is certainly overlap of interest, and that could be actually good, because then more people are in the room and more people get to actually interact.
I mean, just to respond to a small part of that, I was particularly displeased to see the scheduling of Tidy this year. I had nothing to do with that, but I was happy to see that in the preliminary schedule for next year, it seemed like Tidy had stopped overlapping with the Haskell Symposium. So perhaps that was a sort of just a momentary insanity.
So CUFP was faced with a similar tension as the Haskell Implementer Workshop went before CUFP decided to wind down because there's enough industry commercial conferences out there, where it was CUFP's core audience and ICFP's core audience had largely diverged. And it was becoming more and more painfully apparent over the course of the last few years of CUFP's life here. I feel in some ways, when I look at like the sheer amount of energy there was at Zurich for the Haskell Foundation event, like there was a whole lot of people who showed up and then stuck around for the extra couple of days to do that, like way out of proportion, you know, to like even the population here. I think that it really is a very good fit, modulo the concerns that were just raised, you know, about the fact that it is in one location, right? So even if it was a 1 year on, 1 year off, like bounce around with, you know, depending on how far out of having some way to go to where the developers are. I absolutely agree that Zurich being pinned in one location is a concern, but it's possibly an order of magnitude more more participation than the Haskell Implementers Workshop would otherwise going to see, and that I think is particularly valuable.
So if I remember rightly, the Haskell Implementers Workshop has generally been the other end of ICFP from the Haskell Symposium. So that means that only people who stayed for all 6 days could go to both. And actually very few people stay all 6 days. So I'm not so concerned about moving HIW to a separate event. And you know, maybe it could be with Zurich every other year and with something in the US every other year. But I just think that's not a problem, really. Historically, this is the odd year out that HIW is together with the Haskell Symposium.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, part of the appeal of Zurich, I mean, in addition to sort of already being a sort of large Haskell event, is the willingness of Zurich's organizers to work with us on this. So, you know, I'm not the person to find where the developers are in North America, but, you know, if there were a sort of similar opportunity, I'm sure that would be considered.
Yeah, I'm Farhad Mehta. I'm one of the organizers of Zurich. I just want to say that I was pleasantly surprised when people came up to me to ask me to do this. So, and one of the concerns in my head also was that I believe that this community does need more than one pole, and I don't want to take away something from ICFE because I too think this is a great event, right? And from my point of view, I would like to support the community with this, but if we see that it doesn't work out 1 year, I'm okay with moving it back here. I mean, there's no real thing. I just think, yeah, I would just try it for 1 year. I'd be open to trying it for 1 year. That's it. Yeah.
I think it's fine. I think if it's a matter of like some to say that the workshop is moving to a different place, but my comment is pretty more in the spirit of Richard's observation that we should like tear down walls. So if it so happens that next year someone is coming to ICFP and he wants to talk about some of the internals of GHC that has been working on, by all means, it's like, you can't say, no, this is going to be a Haskell Symposium and, you should have been over at Zurich Hack a few months ago, right? That's the spirit of my comment, of my suggestion.
Yeah, no, I think it's certainly the intention that, the talks that would be given at HIW will always be welcome at the Haskell Symposium in one form or another, yeah.
So I've been thinking a little bit about John's question about branding of my combined symposium idea. I think I probably overstepped when I said that it should include Idris and Kak and Agda. I think instead it would be something that's focused on sort of languages that come from the Hindley-Milner discipline and that are typed. So there's some papers at ICFP that aren't, and that the focus of it would be on more implementation-y stuff and less proofy stuff. And I don't know quite how to nail that last piece down, but that's kind of that's just where I'm thinking about it.
One thing that worries me is a little bit is the thought that, if a paper is theoretical, you put it in an A conference. If it's practical, you put it in a C conference. We don't want that picture. Now, maybe it's best addressed by getting Haskell Symposium a better rating, but that thought worries me a little bit.
Yeah, so on that idea, John, how do we take the symposium from a C to a B or something like that to sort of make it a bigger part of people's careers where publish or perish is the norm? Is there a path?
So I think a lot of these ranking systems are somewhat obscure in their internal methodology, and I mean, I know like ICFP itself sort of dropped a level in the core rankings a couple years ago, and that made a bunch of people very upset. Sometimes I think that can lead to focusing on the wrong metrics, right? Like admission, acceptance rate tends to be valued in these kinds of things, and I feel like I actually feel like the program committee at Haskell is not, unstrict, right? Like I think the papers are reviewed, with a reasonable amount of strictness, and there are sort of clear criteria. So I don't know that sort of trying to do something artificial, like saying like, well, let's aim for a 40% accept rate, or let's aim for a 35% accept rate, is really going to sort of push the symposium in the direction that would make it the best venue.
I mean, I have to imagine that these ratings also depend on sort of citation rates, and if we, so I'm picturing if there's a paper that's like the description of some more implementation-y thing, and then other people end up building that on that implementation, they'll cite the paper, and so if, as a review criterion, we could say that we're looking, and in the call for papers, we're looking for papers that lay down foundations upon which stuff can be built. And that could be part of the call, that could be part of the review process. Then that might draw in papers that then other people do build on, and that might increase citations, which might eventually work our way up.
So I think it is fairly opaque how these ratings get assigned, but I'm thinking recently I know of ICFP being downgraded one step, but also ICST, which is the International Conference on Software Testing, what I'm also interested in, was upgraded from C to A. And that was as a result of a letter that was written to the body that does this stuff. And there were a number of arguments made in there. For example, that the top people in the field usually attend. And isn't that true of the Haskell Symposium? So it might be that by studying that letter, perhaps others of the same kind, we might find out what are the key things that we need to focus on to push for the Haskell Symposium to be upgraded.
So what's one quick observation about your idea about turning walls, right, and putting everyone together. That will be a lot of work because, it means like, maybe we need to join identities, right? Or maybe people want to have their own place where they belong to and so on. So there is some work there. So my top level message with that idea is like, do not underestimate the culture of the other communities, right? So it will be some work there to do that. Yeah, that's it.
Sort of, my main concern with this, if we were to do this, sort of break it into a day of joined walls and a day of non-joined walls is, okay, so you get your rejection from ICFD, you get your rejection from the joint symposium, and then you get your rejection from the Haskell Symposium. That was all I wanted to say.
I mean, certainly as a first step, we could just try to coordinate, program committee, coordinate among the program committees. And I think maybe that's a reasonable discussion that we can have, if there's a joint session, right? Or if there's a joint keynote and a joint session, that perhaps that's a starting point, that we can consider, without having to sort of formally invite people to submit to the 2026 Functional Programming and Not Proving Thank You Symposium. Yeah, we'll call it NPP. Symposium on Unproven Code. All right.
Just to go on record, I think that's a great idea. Incremental steps are great.
All right. Well, I want to say thank you to all of you again. I mean, the Haskell Symposium wouldn't be what it is and wouldn't be what it will be without the participation of all of you. Special thanks to the student volunteers and the student AV volunteers who've made all of that work. And I look forward to seeing all of you in Singapore next year. Ciao.